Yeah, I don't want to. There we go. Okay. All right, well, we are officially at office hours, so any questions you may have, let me know. Or if there's anything we need to go over again.
I have kind of a general question about using
Yeah.
different kinds of functions. I had been working on the homework, like the homework that's due at the end of next week. I guess my question is like, how do you decide when you want to use an arrow function that's assigned to a variable with a name versus like naming the function? Because I had solved something by naming a function, by doing a named function and changing your arrow function. And then I saw somebody else had a question about theirs, like on the Slack channel, and they had done it like a different way where they, it hadn't occurred to me to us, like you could just export the variable just using the variable name, like after you created it or whatever. And I was like, oh, that's cool. That's another way to do that. But then how do you decide between those two? Like,
oh, okay, let me share desktop. So if I have, say, should be able to see this code sandbox, right?
right.
All right, so let me change my thing here. All right, so let's create a new file. We'll just say module.js. So you're saying the difference between this versus oh my God, I can't type today either. Or like between these two?
Well, it was more like, I think you can't do, like, I was trying to do the default export, and I think you can't do that with, like I was trying to do export default const, whatever the name of it equals.
Export
And
default
then
const.
make it the whole arrow function. And then like, I figured, okay, this is not working. How can I do this? And I decided to name the function instead of assigning it to a variable with a name.
So
but I saw somebody else like just basically just exported it in a separate thing where they're not, not where they're creating it,
So you were trying to do this?
Something
yeah,
like that. Exactly.
That won't work.
Right. And so then I kind of moved on to a different way to do it. My solution was to actually like name the function and take the arrow function out and make it like a named function with the name of.
Right. So the reason this doesn't work is because export default, it expects something that's already been defined. So you're in this case, you're trying to define it at the same time you're trying to export it as a default, and that just doesn't work. Like
but it works if you make it a named function though, because that's how we did it with Max, and like that's what I changed it to. So if you call the function hello, like if you make it export default function hello and then do the function, like take the arrow out and do it like the
right, because like you're saying like this.
Yeah.
So because here's what happens. Functions get what's called hoisted to the top, right? As soon as you declare a function.
Right. Okay.
So what's going to happen is JavaScript compiler is going to go through this twice. And the first time around, it's going to say, hey, where's all your functions? Cool. I'll define those. Those are now, they now live up here somewhere. Now it actually exists. Whereas a const, that doesn't get hoisted. So you can't export it at the same time you define it. Whereas the function gets hoisted up, it's already defined, and then you can export it.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the difference there.
So how would you decide how you wanted to do that? Like, is there any?
If I wanted to, let's say, if I wanted an arrow function as my default export, I would do this. I'd say const hello, or whatever it happens to be, right?
Okay.
And I'd say export default hello.
Okay.
I define it like this, and then
Mhm.
export it in a separate line.
Okay. And I guess I'm just asking because I understand both, and now I understand why the other one wasn't working. Thank you.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering how you would decide whether you wanted to make it
The
a
decision between,
function named hello versus like a const hello with a function assigned to it.
it depends on how it's going, like it really depends on the function body.
Okay.
And let me give you an example. So if I have a function called greeting, and I say I'm going to return, or let's say, no, I'm going to say console.log, oops, this dot, I don't know, value, or this dot message. This isn't going to, so the value of this, did you guys go over this in the JavaScript?
A little bit.
A little bit?
I don't feel completely comfortable with it, but like.
So
yeah.
the value of this depends on a bunch of different things. Okay, so, and there's like a hierarchy, which I had notes on somewhere that were really clear, but so when a function gets called, the value of this is the value of the thing that's calling the function. So
Okay.
if it's a component that's calling the function, the value of this is that component. It's not this function that's right here, right? Whereas if I were to, like if I needed this sort of functionality in there, I would not create an arrow function, right? So, because you can't, well, an arrow function automatically assumes that, let me try to remember this correctly. I use it just like, I just use them, so I don't even really think about it anymore.
Mm.
Hold on, let me look this up. Let's see. Arrow function this. It sometimes gets confusing to remember. Yeah, so it doesn't have a binding to this. And, oh, right. So if I were to do like a for loop, say for I equals 0, I is less than 10 or something, right? And then I plus plus. Maybe that's not the right thing I'm thinking of. Anyway, so the value of this for arrow functions is kind of like it's gone, right? There's no this in an arrow function. If you need that sort of functionality, you have to use the function keyword.
Mhm.
And this gets like to be a confusing topic, and it's the reason that I kind of avoid this sort of thing in React, simply because like now that we can use functions for components for basically everything, there's no reason to really do this sort of thing. So you can pass something into an arrow function that represents the thing you want this to be, right? We don't have to use the this keyword anymore. Whereas with functions, you have to take that into account. Like you have to manage that whole this value. So it all depends on what's going on inside of the function and what kind of functionality you want to have. A perfect example are classes in JavaScript. So a class is really just, well, it's a function that behaves like a class. So if I wanted to create a new class of something, okay, I would say function animal, right? And then let's say this animal has a name And my constructor.
I thought that
Let's
was
say-
a class about, like, I thought if you're using this, that is a class. Like,
No, this just this value has many different types of values depending. Let's see, this dot name, controls name.
yeah, I have to review this section of.
Yeah,
the
so
class
there's
that I
like,
taught before, because I think I need to kind of, there's some stuff on the mapping API documentation that uses classes, and I'm probably going to just try to translate it over to use state. But I have to go back and watch that part of your video from class to at least, like, see how you would do that.
yeah, the classes, they get real confusing, and it's been a while since I've really delved into classes. There's a couple instances where when I worked at Raymore, we used a class for managing a specific request and whether or not that request has changed over time. And I think that was related to like doing searches, something with search. Searches for e-commerce sites, the logic for searching is usually really complex because that's the whole site. Like that's the whole reason you go to the site is to search for things, right? So if you're selling stuff and you don't have a good search mechanism, people are just like, that site's terrible, right? So there's one of the hobbies that I do is model railroading. And there's a bunch of different sites that sell these things, right? But there's certain sites that have better search features. So I tend to navigate towards those because I know I can search for what I want, right? And that goes for any product. And I was just commenting on that the other day with someone. I said, oh, yeah, well, that site just has terrible search functionality. So I usually avoid it. And they kind of agreed with me because we can never find what we're looking for at that site. So we can never tell if something is, on sale or whatever, right? And so if you don't have great search functionality, you're doing a disservice to your company. And that's kind of off topic, but it's also relevant in creating applications and web applications. Yeah, but so back to your main question of when would you use either? If you're not using this keyword, like if you don't need that sort of functionality in your function, you could do either and it doesn't really matter. They're both going to accomplish the same thing at that point. It all comes down to whether or not you need this or not. I think arrow functions just completely ignore it. I think that's the whole deal. Like it's the way they're designed is it's just a function for a function's sake, right? Like it's just like, hey, this thing's going to do something. That's it. It's just going to do this thing that I tell it. Whereas this style of function, it can do what you tell it to, but there's more complexity, right? Simply because before arrow functions did like everything. They just like they were, they had to bake all that functionality into it to handle all the different paradigms and everything. Now we have an option. Well, I don't really need all that extra stuff, so I'm going to do it this way. It's more concise, or more succinct, I should say. You can do inline functions as like for callbacks and things like that, right? So if I were to have, let's see, instead of function greeting, let's say I take a callback and then I do something and then I call that callback as soon as I get it. Well, if I were to call this greeting, if I were to call this greeting function, I can say greeting, right? I need to pass it the callback. Well, if I do this, yeah, I could do that, right? Or I could just say, this, right? It's a lot more concise. I can fit it on one line. I have that whole implicit return thing, right? So I don't need multiple lines anymore. It's just, they both have their place. So whether or not to choose const or function, just again, comes back to like the complexity of it and everything like that.
Okay, yeah, I don't know if I remember seeing that before where you actually have a name function, but you're still using the arrow. So cool. I didn't realize you could do that as well.
Oh, like this?
No, like on line 9.
On line 9? Oh yeah, so this greeting, That's this function. I'm just
Oh, you're
calling it.
just calling it. Oh, I'm sorry.
And
Then you've
this
got
right
another function
here.
inside of it. Okay.
Yep. So that's the same as like
Got it.
doing that,
Okay. Thank
right?
you.
I'm just saving myself the typing and just doing that.
Right. Okay.
I'm just being, cleaner with my code.
Yeah. Thanks. That's helpful. I just
That's all makes sense.
kind of new to see, like, we've seen arrow functions before, but usually they were like, I don't know, anonymous or whatever. Like they weren't assigned to a variable or anything like that. Or
Yeah.
it's the longer written out one. So it's just new for me to think about two ways of naming something. So.
But this is also valid. This is also an anonymous function. But
Mhm.
here's the other thing that you can do with functions is even though like this is anonymous, right? And that's going to be handled appropriately. I can actually give this a name. And this is fine. This actually works. What happens is JavaScript's going to attach this name to it so that if you, and there's people out there that swear by, they do this all the time. They name every single function no matter what. There is a benefit in that if you have an error, if you look at the call stack or the stack trace, this name will show up in there rather than just some anonymous function. You don't know where is this anonymous function being called. If you give it a name, you'll see it there. Right. So especially if there's really complex sort of like functions using functions, that makes sense. Like it all depends on how religious you want to be about it, basically.
So maybe if you're trying something new that you think might have a lot of errors, it might be better.
Yeah,
to
exactly. That's a great way to do it. Say, well, if this errors out, at least I'll know which function it errored inside of. Yeah. Cool. So does that answer all your concerns?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
What else do people have?
I have a question. So yesterday I was working on those, I think you saw in Slack, but the named import and the default, which I see how to do. I understand like literally how to type it out and do them separately, but I watched your video a couple of times and I'm still not entirely clear as to what exactly the difference is. Like the named is the whole thing and the default is something else, or?
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. So let's go with this file right here.
Okay.
Let's get rid of that. We've got a const hello. We'll keep this one as, we'll do this as a name. We'll do this as a name. And for this, we're going to export something different as the default. So here, we're just going to say, we're going to create an object. We're going to do that. So here's the difference. When importing, say import this stuff, I can import hello from module. Right, I can do that. I'm grabbing this by name because it's explicitly do this. Oh, does it up and down? That's fine. So it's explicitly exported that way. So I can export that, or I can import that one thing. I don't need to import anything else. Or I could export a bunch of different stuff as the default. Now, when I import that, let's just say import, module from module. This value here is this object with all these things in it. So to access that, I would say module.greeting, right? Because this variable holds whatever default exports. Now, this could be like everything in this file, like literally everything. I may not want to import all that stuff because if I'm doing that, when I'm bundling everything together, I may have extra code in there that's never used. right? So my file size might be bigger depending on how I'm bundling things, right? So that may be completely useless.
So like export default is like some part of the file or specific parts is what you're saying? Or it's either the everything or specific?
Default is whatever you put after the keyword default. And it's only one thing, right? So let's say, for example, let me get rid of this because it's causing linting errors. Let's say I want to export default greeting. So my default export is just this function. That's all it is. If that's all there was, right? So if I get rid of these named exports, I no longer can import this thing because it's not exported anywhere. I'm only exporting this one thing. So in order to get this, I have to, well, I have to do something like this. Now I can export both of these things, right? And that's the only way I can grab it now. Now this is going to be an object that for the keys represent the functions that are in the export or that are in this module. So think of default as you're exporting one thing. And if you want more than one thing to come out of here, you have to use a different structure than just saying this, because you can't do this. That doesn't work. You can only have one default export. So to get around that,
Other named ones, right?
right, but if you don't have any named ones, then
Right.
the only way to export that thing is to use some sort of structure, whether it's an object or an array, and pass all that stuff in there. Think of default as if you don't tell it explicitly what to import, this is what you get instead.
So when you
Whereas if I
import
named
that,
it,
you said import module for module. So when you import it with more than one thing, you would just use the name of the file for what you import?
I
there?
could, yeah, I could call this cheese. It doesn't really matter.
Okay.
What? Oops, hold on.
When you're
Not
importing.
there. Okay.
it doesn't
So
matter at all.
this is just a variable that holds whatever this thing exports by default. It's kind of like saying const this equals, give me this whole thing.
So if
With
you
your-
import cheese, you're really picking everything that's in this module.js file or no?
everything
when I
Or
say-
does it depend on what you're writing down there? That's what I don't understand.
So this, whatever's in here, whatever's in this variable, we'll just say my variable.
Yeah.
Whatever's in here is whatever comes after the keyword default. But in this case, it's an object with two values in it. If I were to change this to just greeting, this function greeting, my variable now holds a reference to greeting. That's it. Nothing else. It's what this variable holds whatever comes after default. This is the thing I'm exporting. When I import it, that's where I put it. Does that make sense that way?
That makes sense, but then it seems the same as name to me. I just don't see the difference.
The difference is that if I'm exporting things by name, now it doesn't matter that there's a default export. I can just pluck those things out individually whenever I want. It's just two ways to import things.
So it's kind of the same thing, just two different styles.
Yeah, you can think about it that way, right? So I can export one thing. It could be a single function. It could be a single string. It could be an object full of things. Or I can export everything individually. That way users of my library can import things individually instead of importing the whole thing. So React is a really good example of that. If I import React from React, this variable React holds the entirety of this React library module, all of it, right? So I could say React dot, there's use state, right? Now I have access to use state off of this module, right? So it's kind of like I'm importing an object with all these different, variables that are the names of all my functions that I import from React. Or I could decide, you know what? All I want is use state. Pull that one out. And so that's different from.
So it's like the entire group of stuff you have, you're either pulling something specific or.
Right. I'm either pulling, in this case, the entire module, because that's what is the default export for React. Or I just want to pluck one thing out. I don't want all of React. I only want this function.
Right. So somebody who works at React has put everything in their entire database or whatever you call it into that default, export default, and it's like curly braces with like everything that they offer versus, and I guess JavaScript is just looking at the word import and whatever comes after that. If it's there's no curly braces around it, it's importing whatever the default is. If there's curly braces, it's getting those particular things.
You got it. That's exactly it. Yep. So I can decide to bring in the whole library, or I can decide to bring in only one piece of it, or two pieces, right? I can say this. I can bring in two of them. If I didn't do it that way, right? Let's do this. Because we've been doing it that way the whole time. If I wanted to use state right here, to use the use state hook, I'd have to say const, let's say, I don't know, number, set number equals react.use state. I'd have to do it that way.
Because you need to target it now because you have the whole thing.
I have the whole thing. So now
you have to target it that way because you didn't do it as a name specific thing.
Right.
Because you're pointing within the whole, whatever we're calling it, library.
You got it. Yep.
It's an object, right? Because it's using dot use state to get to the next level of the object.
Yes. So you could totally do it this way if you wanted to. That's totally fine. But here's the other thing. Let's say this file is absolutely huge, right? Like there's all this stuff going on. The first thing you see is import React. Immediately, I would think, okay, this is just some generic component down there somewhere. Nothing special going on. Then I get down here and I'm like, oh, wait. Oh, there's state in this thing. Oh, I need to take a closer look. So if I do this, in fact, let's just pull this in. The first thing I see is, oh, this is a component that has state. I already know, right? I already know the intent of the previous developer because they plucked this out explicitly. So I know going into this component that this is going to be the functionality inside of it, right? Whereas if it was just React, I have no idea. I have to go investigate the entire component to see what's going on, right? And you could also do this. You could also say, I want to import all of React, but because I want to use a bunch of different features for this thing, but I want to explicitly use this somewhere in the component. That's totally cool too. So you can import the entire module. If you put a comma, then you can start plucking out things individually. And now this kind of was the case for a long time, because if you didn't import React, then all this JSX wouldn't work properly because it needs a reference to where the definitions for that exist. Now that's not really needed with like Create React App because the new React scripts package kind of does that for you by default. So you don't technically need it going forward, but that was the case for like many, many, many years. You had to pull in React, period, right? Otherwise JSX wouldn't work properly. But now that's been kind of worked out, especially with the new latest Create React App. So next time you use Create React App, you'll notice that import React has kind of gone away, and you're only plugging in what you want.
So the point of doing React, comma, and then use state in the curly braces would be, or at least one of the points would be that you could, you wouldn't have to say React.use state every time you used it. Even
Yeah, so if I
even
were
though
to,
it's been imported already by typing React as the default.
yeah, so before, in order for this to be a React component, you had to import React. Otherwise, the bundler is not going to know what the heck this stuff is, right? So this was very important. So in order to pluck out something specifically, this was like the pattern you typically see. Whereas now, with the tooling that's been updated, all that importing React is already taken care of for you, because the create React app already knows it's a React application, so it should import React for you. So all you have to worry about is the functionality that you want.
I'm just thinking, like, is it common once you start making bigger, more complex programs to have like 5 or 10 things in that stuff you need to import, and maybe it's easier to just import the whole thing, but then.
Well, this goes back. So even if I needed this, and there's another hook called use ref, and there's one called use callback. If I needed all this stuff, I still would not do React.that, React.that, React.that. And it goes back to what I said earlier, where if I can't see what's in this file, and I look at the first line, I already know the intent. I already know these things are going to be used, right? So it tells me as a developer going in, I know I'm going to be using use ref. I better know what that is, right? So it tells the next developer, hey, here's the stuff you're going to need to know about inside this file.
It's like a marker for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good word for it. It's like having a table of contents. Like, here's the stuff that's going to be in here.
Okay. Yeah. And like you said, because you have a knowledge, like what they might be attempting with the use ref or whatever.
Yeah, it's like, or if you've never used use callback before, you're like, oh, better read up on that, right? So to get a better understanding. Yeah, so actually, let me touch on use callback. This is just kind of like more of an advanced thing. If let's say, I'll just do an arrow function inside the component. So we'll say log something. It doesn't really matter. Oops. Something. Right, so I defined inside this component. Let me get rid of this. Inside this component, I defined a function. Well, every time this component renders, like every time, it's going to run through the body of the function. It's going to create a const called this. It's going to set it equal to a function. It's going to render this thing out. If something changes in here, this is going to re-render again. It's going to create another function called that. And every time it's creating this function, like every time it renders, it's creating this thing. Like, we only need to do that once, right? Why would we care, right? Because what that does is, if you have enough of these things, your performance can be impacted by that, because now JavaScript's creating all these functions every time the component renders. And what if that component renders 5 times a second? It has to do a lot of extra work, right? So in order to alleviate that, I'd say use, so I would say const log something equals use callback, which takes a function. In this case, it's the function I just defined. And then it also takes, just like use effect, it takes a dependency array. And what this does is it says, hey, log something is a function, right? Because you use callback creates a callback function. But the next time React renders, if it's going to look at this dependency array and say, has anything in here changed? Oh, it hasn't? I don't need to create this function again. Now I skip it, right? Or let's say that there's props, right? And you want to log something props dot something else, right? So that's what this function does. It logs out this thing. Well, maybe you only wanted to log this thing when something else has a unique value. Like if it's the same value over and over and over, I only want to do it once. So I could listen for changes. And every time this component renders, it's going to say, okay, has this changed? No? Okay, cool. I don't need to define this function. I can keep going. Oh, I see it's changed this time. Cool. I'll put the new value in here. So it recreates the function with the new value. That's the whole point of use callback. So you're not creating the function over and over and over and over and over again, taking up compute cycles. Instead, you're only going to recreate this function if and only if whatever happens in here changes. Now, if I leave this empty, it'll only ever create it once, period. Just like use effect will only ever run once if you give it an empty dependency list. Does that make sense? I know that's kind of like more of an advanced topic, but since it was there, I figured I'd highlight it. Now, we won't really get into this. We won't have a need for that for the last week of class in the application, because our application isn't doing hundreds of different things every render. But for those that showed up today, you'll have a little inkling as to what that is. But there, it's also, if you go to the React docs, all this stuff is there. Does that make sense? What I just explained with use callback? Okay, cool. All right. We went over use effect, use state. You have an idea of what use callback is. Use ref. Someone had a question on refs before. Was it someone that's here? I don't remember. Someone had asked if they had read somewhere that you should never use refs or something like that. Oh, that was you? Okay. So what a ref does is it creates a reference to something, whatever you want that something to be. And it holds that reference for the life of the component. It never changes unless you tell it to change. And the reason that would be useful, let me think of a good one. Okay, let's do this. Let's talk about maybe something's positioned on the screen somewhere. Maybe you're programming a game made in React, some sort of like a chess game. Let's say a chess game. And you have references to each of the pieces on the screen. Well, let's say that every time it renders, it's going to have to create all these things all over again, right? And you may not know where that piece is, so you may not know how to grab it for the next player's action or something like that. So you could say, all right, well, I'm going to create a ref to the element that represents my chess piece. That way I always know where it is. If that piece never changes on the screen, that's fine. I'll always have a reference to its coordinates for the life of this component. I don't have to go searching for it again. I have one reference to it. If I need to know what it is, I access the ref to grab the stuff out of it, right? But if it does change, I tell the ref, oh, you have a new value. And so here it is. And the way that would look, how it looks is when you're using it is you would create a ref like this. You'd say const, we'll say paragraph ref equals use ref. And we'll just set it to null at first because we don't know what it is yet. This component hasn't rendered. And then any element can take a ref. You tell it which one. So now this ref has an explicit link to this element. whenever I want to know something about this element, I can access it through here. And the way I do that is through this isn't basically what this is. It's an object that doesn't change. But if I want to grab values off of it, I would say whatever that ref is, dot current. Dot current represents this thing here, whatever's currently in this ref. So I could say dot current dot, if I needed to focus it, let's say it was a form field or something like that, I could say dot current dot focus, and now that will be, my cursor will go inside that input field or something like that. Like I can explicitly, whatever current is, focus it, right? In this case, it would be this, which would be useless because you can't really focus p tags, but, or I could say dot class list, right? Dot add, and I can add a class to it. So current, because it's represented by this p tag here, any properties of that element I now have access to. Current is just this thing. If I ever wanted to change that, then I would assign it, I'd assign paragraph ref dot current equals the new thing. But for the life of this component, paragraph ref dot current will always be this. So I always have a reference to that thing. Now I can do things, like I said, like you can do a focus, you can force a click event to happen, you can do all kinds of crazy stuff. But it's always explicitly linked to whatever you pass the ref to. This is useful for like DOM manipulation, right? So if you need to move things around the screen, let's say you're creating like a modal, but you can reposition the modal on the screen. You can grab it and drag it and move it to another part of the screen. Well, in order to do that, you need to know the coordinates of it. So you assign it a ref, and then you can tie it to your mouse drag events. And you can say, wherever my mouse is dragging, those coordinates, update those coordinates on that ref. And then as you drag it around, it'll update it on the screen to those coordinates. So just think of it as like an explicit link between a variable and what that variable should be linked to, right? So in this case, paragraph ref is linked explicitly to a p tag. You always have access to it now. And the next time the component re-renders, you won't lose that reference. It's there. It's there for the life of the component. So you don't have to worry about it going away. You don't have to worry about reassigning it every time it re-renders. It's just going to be there the first time. Make sense?
It does.
That's that's a little bit more of the advanced ones too, but.
No, it does make sense. At first I was confused because I was thinking, why can't you just use state? It sounded like it was doing the same thing, but when you gave the example, it makes sense.
So state is different. State holds a value, but it doesn't hold a link to an explicit element somewhere on the screen.
Right. Okay.
Right. Guess it technically could. It's just a value, but it's not guaranteed to be the same thing every render. Right. So you may have every time the component re-renders, there may be some function that updates state, which wouldn't be a good idea every time it renders, because then every time state changes, it re-renders, so you'd have an endless cycle. So, but yeah, so state is typically used for just holding static values, whereas refs are used for holding references to, again, ref is just short for reference to usually some DOM element. It's usually the most used case. You can hold references to other things, like as long as you want, it's just a reference that's never going to change. So if you want to hold a reference to some object that you care about and you never want to lose it during the life cycles of your component, you can use a ref. They're not used a lot. It's typically in those situations, like I just explained, where you need access to some sort of element. It's typically the use case.
And it doesn't matter if it's the DOM or the virtual DOM, like it's pretty much the same difference for
Well,
it.
this is a reference to, that's a good question. It's a reference to the actual, I believe it's to the actual DOM node, because that's the only way you get access to like its coordinates and things like that. Now, if you use a lot of refs, that does take extra, you know, a little extra effort on React's part. Not much, but a little bit. So you don't want 5,000 reps on your page because that's going to slow you down. So it has to, you know, always keep that reference to the DOM node in line. So if it needs to update anything and that component or that element has changed somehow, you know, that's a lot of extra stuff that needs to happen. So like I said, it's not used often, but there's some very good use cases for it. Like the example of moving things around the screen and knowing where the coordinates are and things like that. Or what the height of some element is, right? So if someone resizes a modal on the left and you want the one on the right to change with it, you need a ref to pick up what the coordinates are. That way you can adjust the other ones. You can do all kinds of fun stuff like that. It's useful in games, but it's also useful in forms where, let's say, a user can use the submit button on the form, or they want to submit the form programmatically because of something else that happened. Well, I need a ref on the form tag so I can actually call the submit event on it, right? So I can do that too. Yeah, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be some
pop-up window. I'm not familiar with that term.
with
I'm just Googling it. Modal
Oh.
means like a pop-up window that you can move around on the page and still see what's behind it, but you can.
yeah. So if I were to say, this thing, this is not movable, but this is technically like a modal, right? Because it's this, yeah, it's like a pop-up, but there's extra functionality built into it and things like that. That's what a modal is.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just think of it as a fancy pop-up.
Yeah, you said a chess piece before, so then I was thinking, oh, so that's how you keep, if you had a game of chess, that's how you would keep track of where everything was and let the user drag the pieces around or whatever. But then you're saying you usually don't have a lot of them, so.
Well, in a chess game, you only have so many pieces, so it's not like you have 5,000 of them.
Okay, I didn't know what you meant
Right.
by a lot. Cool.
Yeah, so like, how many pieces are in a, what is it?
I don't know, it's probably at least like 20 or something, right?
There's, 40 pieces? So that's not too bad. Right, like, and that's the whole point of that game is chess, so you're gonna need to use it anyways. So if you need to make performance adjustments, you'll have to figure out different ways to do that. Like use callback, right? So only change this if something changes. And I mean, 40 refs on a page is kind of like, that's child's play to React. But if it's like, 4,000, now you're gonna see some performance implications, especially if those are references to like structures of things and all kinds of stuff.
I have kind of a random question if nobody else has a question right now.
Yep. Let me grab my, sorry, I'm listening. I'm just grabbing my power cord.
Okay. Do you recommend or not recommend the UTF stuff? Like when we did the stuff way back with Caitlin, when we were doing the cart and search, and she was showing us like how to, like we needed like the $sign. And I noticed that you prefer just to use the $sign as opposed to using the actual codes that are out there for
Like the character
various stuff.
codes?
Is this making sense? Our Caitlin here, she helped us work on search and stuff. And when I was doing my part of it, I went through and I got aren't they the UTF codes?
The
Where
ASCII
it
code?
actually
ASCII
represents the
code.
symbol.
Yeah.
Am I saying it wrong?
ASTI.
ESTI?
You're close.
Okay. So do you not recommend using those? Because I noticed that you prefer just to put in like the $sign, like we did the $2 sign. That's supposed to be like
I don't remember using those.
That's your preference.
did. I went and found them.
You did.
Okay. And that's why I was like, I wonder if I'm not supposed to be using these.
No, that's your preference.
Yeah, doesn't matter.
Yeah. As long as you know that character is going to render properly in all the different devices that you are targeting, you're fine. At the end of the day, it's a character. So whether that device can render that character or not. That's up to the device, right? If it knows
Right.
about that character or not. I mean, the $ is pretty universal, so shouldn't have an issue there.
Okay.
Now, if it was something like
What teams?
like something in Arabic, well, if you don't have the font library for Arabic, you're not going to display it right. It's going to be probably some
Some question mark.
rectangle looking icon, right?
Okay. So those aren't universal. I can't assume they're universal. Like when I found the one for the copyright symbol, it's not necessarily assumable that everybody's using that. Is what you're saying.
Well, not everyone might be using copyright correctly, but that's a different thing.
They cut away.
But yeah, so as far as like a copyright symbol, I wouldn't imagine that you'd have a big issue with that symbol.
Did you see it happen on the screen when the game was playing?
No,
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because I went through and I found it for all of mine. Like I found the plus symbol, like I just found them all, and I thought I was doing better code by doing that, but I noticed that you weren't using them. So I don't want to take up too much time. I just
No,
thought
that's just a preference, really. All right. What are the questions you got? Or is there anything that's still unclear in React? Anything that we've gone over? Carolyn, I know you wanted to you had some questions. I didn't know if you wanted to ask those now.
Oh, thank you very much.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm like ignoring the chat because it's not open and I didn't see it.
Yeah. No, when I asked about it being like a README file, you probably already figured this out, but I was referring to the import, use state, use effect, use ref. It's like kind of like a table of contents. Like a README file helps somebody understand what's happening in that program or component or whatever.
Oh, right. Yes.
It's sort of in a way, it kind of does the same thing. Am I thinking of it the right way or?
Yeah. So the README file is your introduction to this application or library or whatever it is, right? It's like, this is the thing you should read first, right? So when you purchase a new product, new physical product, there's an instruction manual. As soon as you open it up, that's what you should read first, right? Or like a quick start guide. Think of it as like a quick start guide, right? So how do I use this vacuum? Well, here's the quick start guide, right? So that's what a README file is. It's like an introduction to whatever that is that you're working with, application, library. Really good README files have like links to more documentation. Really terrible README files are the ones that were never updated when they create React app and it says, here's your README file, right? Like those are the bad ones. But anyone that's working on a library, or a component library or an application, not having a README file is kind of like bad form at this point, right? So it's something you do want to pay attention to because it tells potential users, what they need to know in order to use this thing, or pitfalls or gotchas or caveats, right? Like, hey, if you're using this because of XYZ, it's probably not going to work the way you want it to because this was, blah, 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 right? So yeah, it's just your introduction to that particular thing. I would recommend one for your capstone, sure. Yeah, that shows that you're being proactive and you're saying, here's what my project's all about, right? You don't have to, write down 800 paragraphs of text or anything. Just like, hey, here's how you install this, right? If you're going to work on this, here's how you install it. Here's the main purpose for this project. Maybe some links to some resources of why you chose this thing, right? Hey, this is the problem this project is trying to solve, so the user can say, oh, I see. Okay, this is why I'd want to use this, right?
Yeah, I started a draft of mine, just kind of starting up front, why, and disclaimer, because in my case, it's a mental health app. So it's like, I'm not a doctor, this is not kind of thing. So
Right.
I've got a lot more to put in it, but I started a couple of weeks ago, I just threw together a little something just to get started. So yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, you could also think of a README as like, if you were writing a novel, you'd have an outline. Think of your README as your outline. Like, this is what I want to accomplish.
And is that for users as in the end user of the app, or is that for users as in developers looking at it?
Both.
The README file.
Yeah, it's for both. Anyone who wants to learn about this or use it, that's what it's for.
Would you have like two different ones to target the different audiences? Developer versus user?
That really depends on the project. I see there's a lot of READMEs. There's typically only one like README. And then maybe the first part of the README is, hey, this is what this thing's all about. And at the very bottom, it says, hey, if you want to contribute, this is how you do it. Right. So the developer would typically like say, okay, I want to contribute this thing. Well, it's usually at the bottom of the README. It's like, hey, here's ways you can contribute. It's kind of like how people have formatted over the years.
Yeah, like a
Yeah, I would
code,
I would put both sections. I'd have a section for one and a section for the other.
one file, but
One file.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, because you don't want them jumping around trying to find things. You just want everything that's relevant to both parties, just put it right there. Now, what you could do is you could have a single main README file in like, the source, like not the source folder, but like your main project folder. It says, here's what this application is about. And maybe there's maybe there's a couple of different subfolders that have some complex logic. You could put a README in each of those subfolders that explain the logic for that part of the application. And it's dedicated solely to that part. And the way that would look is, I'm still sharing my screen, right? Let's
So would
say
you access each of those from a main README, or like have links in the main README back to those, or vice versa?
you could. Yep, you could.
But too much. Okay.
There's nothing that says you can't. So let's say I have in my main folder here. How do I create it? Oh, right here. New file, I have my README, right? This is my main README for my entire application. It says, hey, this is what this thing's all about. And then in my components folder, let's say, oh, let's add. Oh, what's going on? That's really laggy. Okay, we done? Nope. Hold on. This is really, really laggy. Okay, there we go. Now we've got really complex component. All right, this thing is really, really complex, right? Whatever this thing is. Inside here, I have I could put a README in here that explains why this thing's so complex and all the things you need to know about this particular component and its subcomponents, right? I don't necessarily need to link that down here, but if a developer is working on my project, just by default, like most developers would say, oh, there's a README in this folder. There's probably some really good information about whatever's in that folder and below, right? So that's typically like, that's the other thing that goes with like intent, right? So if I'm importing use state from React at the top of my file, that shows intent. Same thing with the README. If the developer took enough time to create a README for this section of the application, there's probably some important information in there, right? Or concepts that need to be explained. That's typically where you go to say, okay, I don't get this thing, but I see there's README for it, so I'll start there, right? It's also shows intent at the same time it gives information. Make sense? So whenever you see a README, it's typically like, hey, at this level and down, right? And then you get down into the application a couple levels deep. Oh, there's a README. It must be at this level and down from here. It's like if you had if you had a bookshelf, your first README would be about all the books you have. Then you pick up a book, and the preface to that book would be the README for that book, right? So it's kind of like the first README would be your bookshelf. here's all the books I have and why. I really like science fiction, so that's why this is here. And then you go into the first book and you open it up and say, oh, this one's all about, I don't know, Dragons of Mordor or something like that. That's what this README is about, right? So it's like, it's only that section and on down.
So the app file is not your top file?
No, your top file is your index.js file. Typically,
JS, not H, right, okay. That's where you would, that's
where we
that
import
level
app.
is where the README would go.
No, the README would be at the project level. Before you even get into source. It's at the same level as your package.json file.
Okay,
So if I go to, let's go to,
I need to make a project folder. And, which I probably
So
have
let's-
already.
right, so I'll go to my GitHub and I created my own like state management component library, which is outdated because React has changed over the years, but that's okay. So this README file, so here's my project right here. So here's the source folder,
Yeah.
a bunch of other files. Here's my README, which is this down here. And here's my package.json file. They're at the same level. I haven't even got to the code yet, right? So that's where this exists, the very top parent level.
Okay,
And if I go into source, if I had another README, it would be from here on down.
yes.
In fact, I don't think I have any more READMEs in there. No. But yeah, so that's a good example there. If we go to,
Would you put like a directory of READMEs so they know there's gonna be a README over here, but not here?
for
Or how?
developers, yeah, for developers, probably not. Because if they're working on this application, they'll find them, you know, depending on what part of the application they're in. Like, I would trust to know that developers would say, oh, if there's a README there, it's probably because of at this level, right?
Or for the user, not the coder user, the other user, maybe just a little blurb on in that particular component on that page or something, just to tell them they could click for like a little README on that page even.
If you want to go, yeah, if you want to go that
Rather
far with
than-
it, you could. There's nothing stopping you from going that far. Yeah.
I mean, the coder wouldn't necessarily find that beneficial or whatever, but just if you want.
Well, an end user is typically like if they're going to your website, the end user is typically probably not going to go to your GitHub.
No, they're not. They don't, never heard of it probably.
Right. So, so as far as the README goes for most GitHub projects, 9 times out of the 10, it's for the developers
Okay,
or anyone that just, and the other 1 out of 10 is usually people that are just kind of curious to know what this thing's about.
yeah. So like the disclaimer, I talk about how, you know, this app does not replace a doctor, blah, blah, blah. That would not be a README file. That would just be something that goes on the site for.
Something like that I would put in the README and on the site.
Okay,
Cover your bases there,
Yeah.
right? Because there are people that will take advantage of the fact that you do not put that in there.
yeah, it is legal, especially in this field.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, the company I work for now is in the healthcare space, and yeah, for sure, it's you have to dot all I's and cross all T's like twice. So. All right, yeah. So, example with careers in code. There's no README here, but there could be that describes, you know, what careers in code is about. Or I could delve into some folders, go down in here and say, oh, there's a README for this one. This tells me about what's here on down, which happens to be, you know, the thing you guys are working on. Good questions though. What else you guys got for me?
How is it possible to just do everything we need to do? Like it seems like every time we learn something, we learn a whole other set of other things you need to do with that. Then you still have to be worried about security, and that's in-house and outside. Like just how is this done other than you being a huge company that can delegate little bits and pieces to folks?
That's a great question. How is that done? If you have a company of one person, it's just you, guess who has to do all of it? You. If you have a company of a team of developers, guess who does it? It's spread, all the responsibilities are spread across the different teams, right? So there's a security team, there's a development team, there's a database, data team, there's marketing, like those are responsible for that. But like it all comes down to who is responsible for each thing based on how many people are at that particular company. If it's just you, it's all on you. How do you do it all? Well, you have to decide how you're going to get to it all, right? Or if you get hired somewhere and there's a team of developers and a whole team of security analysts and all this other stuff, well, each team is responsible for each part of that company's product. So it's just who does it, whoever's assigned to do it, whether it's you, because it's only you, or it's a whole team, a whole company full of people. It can be extremely overwhelming if it's just you, because, well, it's just you got to do everything. You got to wear 500 hats, right? Or, it gets easier if your job is to focus on one part of this company's product, right? So that's the place to start, right? At least that's the way most people start. I mean, you've got people that are just so amped up about what they want to do that they just go ahead and they just wear all the hats. They don't care, right? That's their purpose in life. And that's fine, right? It all depends on, your mission for yourself.
I think for me personally, understanding all the hats, if I had to jump into one of those hats and, knowing enough to do that, but I don't want to wear all the hats and I don't want to be ultimately responsible for, legal. I just want to code. I don't know how
Right,
other
so-
people feel.
Yeah, that just comes down to what I just said. If it's just you, you have to wear the hats because it's just you, right? Or you
Our
can
hats don't.
hire. You can hire, like if it is just you at a company, it's your company, you're starting, it's just you are there. You could say, well, I'm really terrible at security, so I'm going to hire a security contractor to handle that part for me. Right? You pay someone to do it for you. Right? So that's why security companies exist, because not everyone knows security, so they hire them to do it for them. Things like that. Are there tools like accessibility tools to check for security issues? Sure. Yeah, I'm not familiar with them all because I'm not in the security space. It's not one of my strong suits. My strong suit is mostly front end, although I can hold my own on the back end too. Like API stuff, I'm okay with. Some database stuff, I'm not like the best database administrator, but I know my way around. But yeah, there's tools out there there's development tools for developers, right? They're built into the browser too, but there's other ones you can get. And there's accessibility tools, there's security tools that monitor your networks and things like that. Absolutely, there's tools out there for every aspect of this stuff. If there is a tool that doesn't exist for applications yet, whatever it happens to be, then I'm yet to know about it. Like it's, I think if there are tools not yet created for application development, those are the tools those are the applications that haven't been developed on platforms we haven't invented yet, right? So for example, the future is going to be kind of like interconnected. I don't want to say hive mind, but think of like was it blockchain? Have you guys heard about blockchain yet? But it's a way to interconnect everything and have immediate access to it, one-to-one. I don't need a middleman. I can just go right to wherever that thing is, and I can trust that source because it's validated through this whole blockchain. Well, all those things are interconnected. So if there's any tools that haven't been created regarding that, well, that's the space where they're going to be created. Or what if there's something beyond blockchain that we get to, right? Something better than that. Tools don't exist yet because we haven't invented that platform yet. So, but yeah, if there's web development, there's a plethora of tools available to us. You just have to search for the general term, and you can start narrowing it down.
And the technology is always ahead of the law, the philosophy, the ethics,
It's never ending.
and trying to play catch up, like things that go on in other countries, who regulates that? Because the internet isn't like in a country. This is library science stuff, but
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, it's way ahead of us, we can't keep, it's hard to anticipate what the security need will be because we don't even know what the devices will be. And it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it gets nuts. Any other React questions before we head out? We're past time, so I wanted to make sure I address any burning questions or any concepts that need explaining. All right, cool. If there's enough, like if people have a lot of questions and they feel like they want another office hours tomorrow, let me know in Slack, or I'll just put a message out in Slack if people feel they need another one. Otherwise, I will see you all on Monday.
Thanks, Joey. See y'all later. Enjoy the weather if you can.
Bye,
I'm gonna
guys.
try to.